Hey friends, we're reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. And as promised, here's our second chapter for the day. This is chapter 12. And this is, I believe, Vught. Get your things together. Get ready to evacuate. Collect all possessions in pillowcases. The shouts of the guards echoed up and down the long corridor. I stood in the center of my cell in a frenzy of excitement. Evacuate? Then something was happening. We were leaving the prison. The counter-invasion must have begun. I snatched the pillowcase from the little wad of straw I'd stuffed into it. What riches this coarse bit of muslin had been in the 2 weeks since it had been provided. A shield for my head from the scratch and smell of bedding. It almost didn't matter that the promised sheets had never arrived. With trembling hands I dropped my few belongings into it. The blue sweater, the pajamas, covered now back and front in embroidered figures, toothbrush, comb, a few remaining crackers wrapped in toilet paper. My Bible was in its pouch on my back, where it remained except when I was reading it. I put on my coat and hat and stood at the iron door, clutching the pillowcase in both hands. It was still early in the morning. The tin breakfast plate had not yet been removed from the shelf in the door. Getting ready had taken no time at all. An hour passed. I sat on the cot. 2 hours. 3. It was warm in the cell this late July day. I took off my hat and coat and folded them next to me on the cot. More time passed. I kept my eyes on the ant-hole, hoping for a last visit from my small friends, but they did not appear. Probably I had frightened them by my early dashing about. I reached into the pillowcase, took out one of the crackers and crumbled it about the little crack. No ants. They were staying safely hidden. And suddenly I realized that this too was a message, a last wordless communication among neighbors. For I too had a hiding place when things were bad. Jesus was this place, the rock cleft for me. I pressed a finger to the tiny crevice. The afternoon sun appeared on the wall and moved slowly across the cell. And then all at once there was a clanging out in the corridor. Doors scraped, bolts banged. Out! Schnell! All out! No talking! I snatched at my hat and coat. My door screeched open. Form ranks of 5. The guard was already at the next cell. I stepped out into the hall. It was jammed from wall to wall. I had never dreamed so many women occupied this corridor. We exchanged looks. Invasion, we mouthed silently. The soundless word sweeping through the massed women like an electric charge. Surely the invasion of Holland had begun. Why else would they be emptying the prison? Where would we be taken? Where were we headed? Not into Germany, dear Jesus, not Germany. The command was given as we shuffled forward down the long, chill halls, each carrying a pillowcase with her belongings, forming a little bulge at the bottom. At last we emerged into the wide courtyard inside the front gate of the prison, and another long wait began. But this wait was pleasant, with the late afternoon sun on our backs. Far to the right I could see the columns of the men's section, but crane my neck though I would, I could not see Betsie anywhere. At last the huge gate swung in and a convoy of gray transport buses drove through. I was herded aboard the third one. The seats had been removed, the windows painted over. The bus lurched dreadfully as it started up, but we were standing too close together to fall. When the bus ground to a stop, we were at a freight yard somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Again we were formed into ranks. The guards' voices were tense and shrill. We had to keep our heads facing forward, eyes front. Behind us we could hear buses arriving, then lumbering away again. It was still light, but I knew by the ache in my stomach that it was long past supper time. And then, ahead of me, to the left, in the newest group of arriving passengers, I spotted a chestnut bun. Somehow, someway, I was going to get to her. Now, instead of wanting the day to end, I prayed that we would stay where we were until dark. Slowly, the long June day faded. Thunder rumbled and a few drops of rain fell. At last, a long row of unlit coaches rolled slowly over the tracks in front of us. They banged to a stop, rolled forward a little farther, then stopped again. After a while, they began backing. For an hour or more, the train switched back and forth. By the time the order came to board, it was pitch dark. The ranks of prisoners surged forward. Behind us, the guards shouted and cursed. Obviously, they were nervous at transporting so many prisoners at one time. I wriggled and shoved to the left. Elbows and shoulders were in my way, but I squirmed past. At the very steps of the train, I reached out and I seized Betsie's hand. Together we climbed onto the train. Together found seats in a crowded compartment. Together wept tears of gratitude. The 4 months in Scheveningen had been our first separation in 53 years. It seemed to me that I could bear whatever happened with Betsie beside me. More hours passed as the loaded train set on the siding. For us they flew. There was so much to share. Betsie told me about each of her cellmates, and I told her about mine and the little hole in which they scrambled at any emergency. As always, Betsie had given to others everything she had. The Bible that Nolly had smuggled to her, that she had torn up and passed around book by book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning that the train at last began to move. We pressed our faces to the glass, but no light showed and clouds covered the moon. The thought uppermost in every mind was, is it Germany? At one point we made out a tower that Betsie was sure was the cathedral at Delft. An hour or more later, the clack of the train changed pitch. We were crossing a trestle, but a very long one. As the minutes passed and still we had not reached the other side, Betsie and I exchanged looks. The Moorditch Bridge? Then we were headed south, not east into Germany, but south to Brabant. For the second time that night we wept tears of joy. I leaned my head back against the wooden slats of the seat and shut my eyes, reliving another train trip to Brabant. Mama's hand had gripped Father's, then as the train swayed. Then, too, it was June, the June of the first sermon, of the garden back at the manse of Carol. I must have fallen asleep back in that other June, for when I opened my eyes, the train had stopped. Voices were shouting at us to move. Schneller, aber schnell. An eerie glare lit the windows. Betsie and I stumbled after the others along the aisle and down the iron steps. We seemed to have stopped in the middle of a woods. Floodlights mounted in trees lit a broad, rough, clear path lined by soldiers with leveled guns. Spurred by the shouts of the guards, Betsie and I started up the path between the gun barrels. Schneller, close ranks, keep up, 5 abreast. Betsie's breath was coming short and hard, and still they yelled at us to go faster. It had rained hard here, for there were deep puddles in the path. Ahead of us, a white-haired woman stepped to the side to avoid one. A soldier struck her in the back with a gun butt. I took Betsie's pillowcase along with mine, hooked my other arm through hers, and hauled her along beside me. The nightmare march lasted a mile or more. At last we came to a barbed wire fence surrounding a row of wooden barracks. There were no beds in the one we entered. The only long tables with backless benches pulled up to them. Betsie and I collapsed onto one of these. Under my arm I could feel the irregular flutter of her heart. We fell into an exhausted sleep, our heads on the table. The sun was streaming through the barracks window when we woke up. We were thirsty and hungry. We had nothing to eat or drink since the early meal at Scheveningen the morning before, but all that day no guard or any official appeared inside the barracks. At last, when the sun was low in the sky, a prisoner crew arrived with a great vat of some thick, steamy substance that we gobbled ravenously. And so began our stay in this place that we learned was named Vught, after the nearest small village. Unlike Scheveningen, which had been a regular Dutch prison, Vught had been constructed by the occupation, especially as a concentration camp for political prisoners. We were not yet in the camp proper, but in a kind of quarantine compound outside. Our biggest problem was idleness, wedged together as we were around the long rows of tables with nothing to do. We were guarded by the same young woman who had patrolled the corridors at Scheveningen. They had been adequate enough as long as we were behind locked doors. Here they seemed at a loss. Their only technique for maintaining discipline was to shriek obscenities and hand out punishments to all alike. Half rations for the entire barracks, an extra roll call at rigid attention, a ban on talking for 24 hours. Only one of our overseers never threatened or raised her voice. This was the tall, silent head matron from Scheveningen. She appeared in Vught the third morning during the pre-dawn roll call, and at once something like order seized our rebellious and untidy ranks. Lines straightened, hands were clamped to sides, whispers ceased, and those cold blue eyes as they swept across us. Amongst ourselves, we nicknamed her the General. During one long roll call, a pregnant woman at our table slumped to the floor, striking her head against the edge of the bench. The General did not so much as pause in her expressionless reading of names. We had been in this outer camp at Vught almost 2 weeks when Betsie and I, along with a dozen others, were called out by name during a morning roll call. When the rest had been dismissed, the General distributed typewritten forms along us and instructed us to present them at the administration barracks at 9 o'clock. A worker on the food crew, a long-term prisoner from the main camp, smiled encouragingly as he handed out our breakfast. "You're free," he whispered. "Those pink forms mean release." Betsie and I stared disbelievingly at the sheets of paper in our hands. Free? Free to leave? Free to go home? Others crowded around, congratulating us, embracing us. The women from Betsie's cell at Scheveningen wept unabashedly. How cruel to have to leave all these behind. Surely the war will be over very soon, we told them. We emptied our pillowcases, passing out our few belongings among those who had to stay. Long before 9, we were standing in the big wooden anteroom of administration. At last we were summoned to an inner office where our forms were examined, stamped, and handed over to a guard. We followed this man down a corridor into another office. For hours the process continued, and we were shuttled from one room and official to another. Questioned, fingerprinted, sent on to the next post. The group of prisoners grew until there were 40 or 50 of us standing in line beside a high anchor chain fence topped with barbed wire. On the other side of the fence was a white birch woods. Above our heads, the blue Brabant sky. We too belonged to that wide, free world. The next barracks we entered held a row of desks with women clerks seated behind them. At one of these I was handed a brown paper envelope. I emptied it into my hand, and the next moment was staring in disbelief at my Alpina watch, Mama's ring, even my paper guilders. I had not seen these things since the night we arrived at Scheveningen. Money? Why, that belonged to the world of shops and trolley cars. We could go to a train station with this money. 2 fares to Haarlem, please. We marched along a path between twisted rolls of barbed wire and through a wide gate into a compound of low tin-roofed barracks. There were many more lines, more waits, more shuffling from desk to desk, but already the camp and its procedures had become unreal to me. Then we were standing before a high counter and a young male clerk was saying, "Leave all personal effects at the window marked C." But they just gave them back to me. Watches, purses, jewelry. Mechanically, like a machine, and with no will of its own, I handed watch, ring, and money through the small barred window. A uniformed woman swept them into a metal box. "Move along. Next." Then, were we not to be released? Outside this building, a florid-faced officer formed us into a double column and marched us across a broad parade ground. At one end of it, a crew of men with shaved heads and striped overalls were digging a ditch. What did it mean? What did any of it mean? This whole long day of lines and waits? Betsie's face was gray with weariness, and she stumbled as we marched. Through another fence we arrived in a yard surrounded on by 3 sides by low concrete buildings. A young woman in a military cape was waiting for us. "Prisoners, halt," barked the red-faced officer. "Explain to the newcomers, Fraulein, the function of the bunkers." "The bunkers," the girl began in a bored voice of a museum guide, "are for the accommodation of those who fail to cooperate with camp rules. The rooms are cozy, a bit small, about the size of a gym locker. To hasten the educational process, the hands are tied above the head." Even as the horrid recital continued, 2 guards came out of the bunkers, carrying between them the form of a man. He was alive. His legs were moving, but he seemed to have no conscious control over them. His eyes were sunken and rolled back in his head. "Not everyone," the girl observed in the same detached drawl, "seems to appreciate the accommodations of the bunkers." I seized Betsie's arm as the command to march came again, more to steady myself than her. It was Father's train case once again. Such cruelty was too much to grasp, too much to bear. Heavenly Father, carry it for me. We followed the officer down a wide street lined with barracks on either side and halted at one of the gray, featureless sheds. It was the end of a long day of standing, waiting, hoping. We had simply arrived in the main camp at Vught. The barracks appeared almost identical with the one we had left this morning, except that this one was furnished with bunks as well as tables and benches. And still we were not allowed to sit. There was a last wait while the matron, with maddening deliberateness, checked our documents again, against a list. "Betsie," I wailed, "how long will it take?" "Perhaps a long, long time, perhaps many years, but what better way could there be to spend our lives?" I turned to stare at her. "Whatever are you talking about?" "These young women, that girl back at the bunker. Corey, if people can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love. We must find the way, you and I, no matter how long it takes." She went on, almost forgetting in her excitement to keep her voice to a whisper, while I slowly took in the fact that she was talking about our guards. I glanced at the matron seated at the desk ahead of us. I saw a gray uniform and a visored hat. Betsie saw a wounded human being, and I wondered, not for the first time, what sort of a person she was, this sister of mine. What kind of road she followed while I trudged beside her on the all-too-solid earth. A few days later, Betsie and I were called up for work assignments. One glance at Betsie's pallid face and fragile form, and the matron waved her contemptuously back inside the barracks, where the elderly and infirm spent the day sewing prison uniforms. The women's uniforms here in Vught were a blue overall with a red stripe down the side of the leg, practical and comfortable, and a welcome change after our own clothes that we had worn since the day of our arrest. Apparently I looked strong enough for harder work. I was told to report to the Phillips factory. This factory turned out to be no more than another large barracks inside the camp complex. Early in the morning, though it was, the tar beneath the shingled roof was beginning to bubble in the hot July sun. I followed my escort into the single large room where several hundred men and women sat at long plank tables covered with thousands of tiny radio parts. 2 officers, one male, one female, were strolling the aisles between the benches while the prisoners bent to their tasks. I was assigned a seat at a bench near the front and given the job of measuring small glass rods and arranging them in piles according to lengths. It was monotonous work. The heat from the roof pressed like a weight on my head. I longed to exchange at least names and hometowns with my neighbors on either side, but the only sound in the room was the clink of metal parts and the squeak of the officers' boots. They reached the door across from where I sat. "Production was up again last week," the male officer said in German to a tall, slender man with a shaved head and a striped uniform. "You are to be commended for this increase. However, we continue to receive complaints of defective wiring. Quality control must improve." The shaved-headed man made an apologetic gesture. "If there were more food, Herr Officer," he murmured. "Since the cutback in rations, I see a difference. They grow sleepy. They have trouble concentrating." His voice reminded me a little of Willem's, deep, cultivated, the German with only a trace of Dutch accent. "Then you must wake them. Make them concentrate. On the penalties. If the soldiers on the front can fight on half rations, then these lazy—" At a terrible look from the woman officer, he stopped and ran his tongue over his lips. I speak, of course, merely as an example. There is naturally no truth in the rumor that rations at the front are reduced, so I hold you responsible." And together they stalked from the building. For a moment the prisoner foreman watched them from the doorway. Slowly he raised his left hand, then dropped it with a slap to his side. The quiet room exploded. From under the tables appeared writing paper, books, knitting yarns, tins of biscuit. People left their benches and joined the little knots of clattering friends all over the room. Half a dozen crowded around me. Who was I? Where was I from? Did I have any news of the war? And perhaps half an hour of visiting among the tables, the foreman reminded us that we have a day's quota to meet, and people drifted back to their places. The foreman's name, I learned, was Mormon, and he had been headmaster of the Roman Catholic boys' school. He himself came over to my workbench the 3rd day I was there. He had heard that I had followed the entire assembly line through the barracks, tracing what became of my dull little piles of rods. "You're the first woman worker here," he said, "who has ever shown any interest in what we are making." "I am very interested," I said. "I am a watchmaker." He stared at me with new interest. That I have work you will enjoy more. He took me to the opposite end of the huge shed where the final assembly of relay switches was done. It was intricate and exacting work, though not nearly so hard as watch repair. And Mr. Mormon was right. I enjoyed it, and it helped me make the 11-hour workday go faster. Not only to me, but to all the Phillips workers, Mr. Mormon acted more as a kindly older brother than a crew boss. I could watch him ceaselessly moving among his hundreds of charges, counseling, encouraging, finding a simpler job for the weary, a harder one for the restless. We had been at Vught more than a month before I learned that his 20-year-old son had been shot here at the camp the week Betsie and I arrived. No trace of this personal tragedy showed in his care for the rest of us. He stopped frequently at my bench the first weeks, more to check my frame of mind than my work, but eventually his eyes would travel to the row of relay switches in front of me. "Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for their fighter planes." And reaching across me, he would yank a wire from its housing or twist a tiny tube from an assembly. "Now, solder them back wrong, and not so fast. You're over the day's quota, and it's not yet noon." Lunchtime would have been the best time of day if I could have spent it with Betsie. However, Phillips workers were not allowed to leave the factory compound until the workday ended at 6. Prisoners on kitchen detail lugged in great buckets of gruel made of wheat and peas, tasteless but nourishing. Apparently, there had been a cutback in rations recently. Still, the food was better and more plentiful than it had been at Scheveningen, where there had been no noonday meal at all. After eating, we were free for a blessed half-hour to stroll about within the Phillips compound in the fresh air and the glorious Brabant sun. Most days I found a spot along the fence and stretched out on the warm ground to sleep. The day started with roll call at 5 a.m. Sweet summer smells came in the breezes from the farms around the camp. Sometimes I would dream that Carol and I were walking hand in hand along a country lane. At 6 in the evening there was another roll call. Then we marched back to our various sleeping barracks. Betsie always stood in the doorway of ours, waiting for me. Each evening, it was as though a week had passed. There was so much to tell one another. That Belgian boy and girl at the bench next to mine, this noon they became engaged. Mrs. Hirma, whose granddaughter was taken to Germany, today she let me pray with her. One day Betsie's news touched us directly. A lady from Ermelo was transferred to the sewing detail today. When I introduced myself, she said, "Another one." What did she mean? "Corey, do you remember the day we were arrested? A man came to the shop. You were sick and I had to wake you up." I remembered very well, remembered the strange roving eyes, the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach that was more than a fever. Apparently everyone in Ermelo knew him. He worked with the Gestapo from the first day of occupation. He reported this woman's 2 brothers for resistance work, and finally herself and her husband too. When Ermelo had finally caught on to him, he had come to Haarlem and teamed up with Wilmes and Captain. His name was Jan Vogel. Flames of fire seemed to leap around that name in my heart. I thought of Father's final hours alone and confused in the hospital corridor, of the underground work so abruptly halted. I thought of Mary Atali arrested while walking down the street. And now I knew that if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now, I could kill him. Betsie drew in the little cloth bag from beneath her overalls and held it out to me, but I shook my head. Betsie kept the Bible during the day, since she had more of a chance to read and teach from it here than I did at the Phillips barracks. In the evening we held a clandestine prayer meeting for as many as could crowd around our bunk. "You lead the prayers tonight, Betsie. I have a headache." More than a headache. All of me ached with the violence of my feelings about the man who had done us so much harm. That night I did not sleep, and the next day at my bench scarcely heard the conversation around me. By the end of the week I had worked myself into such a sickness of body and spirit that Mr. Mormon stopped at my bench to ask if something were wrong. Wrong? Yes, something's wrong, and I plunged into an account of that morning. I was only too eager to tell Mr. Mormon and all Holland how Jan Vogel had betrayed his country. What puzzled me all this time was Betsie. She had suffered everything, and yet she had seemed to carry no burden of rage. "Betsie," I hissed one dark night when I knew that my restless tossing must be keeping her awake. 3 of us now shared this single cot as the crowded camp daily received new arrivals. Betsy, don't you feel anything about Jan Vogel? Doesn't it bother you? Oh, yes, Corey, terribly. I've felt for him ever since I knew, and pray for him whenever his name comes into mind. How dreadfully he must be suffering. For a long time, I lay silent, in the huge shadowy barracks, restless with the sighs, snores, and stirrings of hundreds of women. Once again I had the feeling that this sister, with whom I had spent all my life, belonging to, somehow, to another or order of beings. Wasn't she telling me in her gentle way that I was as guilty as Jan Vogel? Didn't he and I stand together before an all-seeing God, convicted of the same sin of murder? For I had murdered him with my heart and with my tongue. Lord Jesus, I whispered into the lumpy ticking of the bed, I forgive Jan Vogel, as I pray that you will forgive me. I've done him great damage. Bless him now and his family. That night, for the first time since our betrayer had a name, I slept deep and dreamlessly until the whistle summoned us to roll call. The days in Vught were a baffling mixture of good and bad. Morning roll call was often cruelly long. If the smallest rule had been broken, such as a single prisoner late for evening check-in, the entire barracks would be punished by a 4 a.m. or even a 3:30 call and made to stand at parade attention until our backs ached and our legs cramped. But the summer air was warm and alive with birds as the day approached. Gradually in the east a pink and gold sunrise would light an immense Brabant sky as Betsy and I squeezed each other's hands in awe. At 5:30 we had black bread and coffee, bitter and hot, and then fell into marching columns for the various work details. I looked forward to this hike to the Phillips factory. Part of the way we walked beside a small woods, separated only by a roll of barbed wire from a glistening world of dewdrops. We also marched past a section of the men's camp, many of our groups straining to identify a husband or a son among the ranks of shaved heads and striped overalls. This was another of the paradoxes of Vught. I was endlessly, daily grateful to be again with people. But what I had not realized in solitary confinement was that to have companions meant to have their griefs as well. We all suffered with the women whose men were in this camp. The discipline in the male section was much harsher than in the women's. Executions were frequent. Almost every day, a salvo of shots would send the anguished whispers flying. How many this time? Who were they? The woman next to me at the relay bench was an intense communist woman named Fleur. She and her husband had managed to get their 2 small children to friends before their arrest, but she worried aloud all day about them, and about Mr. Fleur, who had tuberculosis. He worked on the rope-making crew in the compound next to Phillips, and each noon they managed to exchange a few words through the barbed wire separating the 2 enclosures. Although she was expecting a 3rd child in September, she would never eat her morning allotment of bread, but passed it through the fence to him. She was dangerously thin. I felt for an expectant mother, and several times I brought her a portion of my own breakfast bread, but this too was always set aside for Mr. Fleur. And yet, in spite of sorrow and anxiety, and no one in the place was without both, there was laughter too in the Phillips barracks, and impersonation of the pompous, blustering 2nd lieutenant, a game of blind man's bluff. A song passed in rounds from bench to bench until thick clouds, the signal might come from any bench which faced a window. The factory barracks was set in the center of the broad Phillips compound. There was no way a camp official could approach it without crossing this open space. In an instant every bench would be filled, the only sound the businesslike rattle of radio parts. One morning the code words were still being relayed down the long shed when a rather hefty offshurin stepped through the doors. She glanced furiously about, face flushed scarlet as she applied thick clouds to her appearance. She shrieked and ranted for a quarter of an hour, then deprived us of our noontime break in the open air that day. After this, we adopted the more neutral signal 15. I've assembled 15 dials. During the long, hot afternoon, pranks and talk died down, as each one sat alone with his own thoughts. I scratched on the side of the table the number of days until September 1st. There was nothing official about that date, just a chance remark by Mrs. Fleur to this effect that 6 months was the usual prison term for ration card offenders. Then if that were the charge, and if they included the time served in Scheveningen, September 1st would be our release date. Corey, Betsie warned one evening when I announced triumphantly that August was half over, We don't know for sure. I had the feeling, almost, that to Betsie it didn't matter. I looked at her, sitting on our cot in the last moments before lights out, sewing up a split seam in my overalls, as she'd so often sat mending under the lamplight in the dining room. Betsie, by the very way she sat, evoked a high-backed chair behind her and a carpet at her feet instead of this endless row of metal cots on a bare pine floor. The first week we were here, she had added extra hooks to the neck of her overalls so that she could fasten the collar high around her throat, and this propriety taken care of. I had the feeling she was as content to be reading the Bible here in Vught to those who had never heard it as she'd been serving soup to hungry people in the hallway at the Bay. As for me, I set my heart every day more firmly on September 1st. And then all of a sudden, it looked as though we would not have to wait even this long. The Princess Irene Brigade was rumored to be in France, moving toward Belgium. The brigade was part of the Dutch forces that had escaped to England during the 5-day war. Now it was marching to reclaim its own. The guards were noticeably tense. Roll call was in agony. The old and the ill, who were slowly reaching their places, were beaten mercilessly. Even the red light commando came in for discipline. These young women were ordinarily a favored group of prisoners, prostitutes mostly from Amsterdam. They were in prison not for their profession, which was extolled as a patriotic duty, but for infecting German soldiers. Ordinarily, with the male guards anyway, they had a bold, breezy manner. Now even they had to form ruler straight lines and stand hours at frozen attention. The sound of the firing squad was heard more and more often. One lunchtime, when the bell sounded to return to work, Mrs. Flor did not appear at the bench beside me. It always took a while for my eyes to readjust to this dim factory after the bright sun outside. It was only gradually that I saw the hunk of black bread still resting at her plate on the bench. There had been no husband to deliver it to. And so, hanging between hope and horror, we waited out the days. Rumor was all we lived on. The brigade was across the Dutch border. The brigade was destroyed. The brigade had never landed. Women who had stayed away from the whispered little prayer service around our cot now crowded close, demanding signs and predictions from the Bible. On the morning of September 1st, Mrs. Flor gave birth to a baby girl. The child lived 4 hours. Several days later, we awoke to the sound of distant explosions. Long before the roll call whistled, the entire barracks was up and milling about in the dark between the cots. Was it bombs? Artillery fire? Surely the brigade had reached Brabant. This was the very day they might be in Vught. The scowls and the threats of the guards when they arrived daunted us not at all. Everyone's mind had turned homeward. Everyone talked of what she would do first. The plants will all be dead, said Betsie, but we'll get some cuttings from Nolly. We'll wash the windows so the sun can come in. At the Phillips factory, Mr. Mormon tried to calm us. Those aren't bombs, he said, and certainly not guns. That's demolition work. Germans, they're probably blowing up bridges. It's meant they expect an attack, but not that it's here. It might not come for weeks. This dampened us a bit. But as the blast came closer and closer, nothing could keep down hope. Now they were so near they hurt our ears. Drop your lower jaw, Mr. Mormon called down the long room. Keep your mouths open and it will save your eardrums. We had our midday meal inside with the doors and windows closed. We'd been working again for an hour or sitting at our benches. No one could work. When the order came to return to dormitories, with sudden urgency, women embraced husbands and sweethearts who'd worked beside them at Phillips. Betsie was waiting for me outside our barracks. Corey, has the brigade come? Are we free? No, not yet. I don't know. Oh, Betsie, why am I so frightened? The loudspeaker in the men's camp was sounding the signal for roll call. No order was given here, and we drifted about aimlessly, listening, we scarcely knew for what. Names were being read through the men's speaker, though it was too far away to make them out. And suddenly an insane fear gripped the waiting women. A death-like silence now hung over both sides of the vast camp. The loudspeaker had fallen silent. We exchanged wordless looks. We almost feared to breathe. Then the rifle fire split the air. Around us, women began to weep. A second volley, a third. For 2 hours, the executions went on. Someone counted more than 700 male prisoners were killed that day. There was little sleeping in our barracks that night, and no roll call the following morning. At 6 a.m. we were ordered to collect our personal things. Betsie and I put our belongings in the pillowcases we had brought from Scheveningen: toothbrushes, needles, and thread, a small bottle of vitamin oil that had come in a Red Cross package, Nolly's blue sweater, which was the only thing we had brought with us when we left the quarantine camp 10 weeks before. I transferred the Bible to its bag from Betsie's back to my own. She was so thin it made a visible bump between her shoulders. We were marched to a field where soldiers were passing out blankets from the backs of open trucks. As we filed past, Betsie and I drew 2 beautiful soft new ones. Mine was white with blue stripes, Betsie's white with red stripes, obviously the property of some well-to-do family. About noon, the exodus from the camp began. Through the drab streets of barracks we went, past the bunkers, through the maze of barbed wire compounds and enclosures, and at last onto the rough dirt road through the woods down which we had stumbled that rainy night in June. Betsie hung to my arm. She was laboring for breath, as she always did when she had to walk any distance. "March! Schnell! Double time!" I slipped my arm beneath Betsie's shoulders and half carried her the final quarter mile. At last the path ended, and we lined up facing the single track, over 1,000 women standing toe to heel. Farther along, the men's section was also at the siding. It was impossible to identify individuals among the shaved heads glistening in the autumn sun. At first I thought our train had not come. Then I realized that these freight cars standing on the tracks were for us. Already the men were being prodded aboard, clambering up over the high sides. We could not see the engine, just this row of small, high-wheeled European boxcars stretching out of sight in both directions, machine guns mounted at intervals on the roof. Soldiers were approaching along the track, pausing at each car to haul open the heavy sliding door. In front of us, a gaping black interior appeared. Women began to press forward. Clutching our blankets and pillowcases, we were swept along with the others. Betsie's chest was still heaving oddly after the rapid march. I had to boost her up over the side of the train. At first I could make out nothing in the dark car. Then in a corner I saw a tall, uneven shape. It was a stack of bread, dozens of flat black loaves piled on top of one another. A long trip then. The small car was getting crowded. We were shoved back against the wall. 30 or 40 people were all that could fit in, and still the soldiers drove women over the side, cursing, jabbing with their guns. Shrieks rose from the center of the car, but still the press increased. It was only when 80 women were packed inside that the door thumped shut, and we heard iron bolts driven into place. We were sobbing, and many fainted, although in the tight-wedged crowd they remained upright. Just when it seemed certain that those in the middle must suffocate or be trampled to death, we worked out a kind of system where, by half sitting, half lying, with our legs wedged around one another like members of a sledding team, we were able to get down on the floor of the car. "Do you know what I'm thankful for?" Betsie's gentle voice startled me in that squirming madhouse. "I am thankful that Father is in heaven today." "Father? Yes, oh Father, how could I have wept for you?" The warm sun beat down on the motionless train. The temperature in the packed car rose. The air grew foul. Beside me, someone was tugging at a nail in the ancient wood of the wall. At last it came free. With the point, she set out to work, gouging the hole wider. Others around the sides took up the idea, and in a while, blessed whiffs of outside air began to circle around us. It was hours before the train gave a sudden lurch and began to move. Almost at once, it stopped again, then again crawled forward. The rest of the day and into the night it was the same, stopping, starting, slamming, jerking. Once, when it was my turn at the air hole, I saw in the moonlight trainmen carrying a length of twisted rail. Tracks ahead must be destroyed. I passed the news. Maybe they would not be able to repair them. Maybe we would still be in Holland when liberation came. Betsie's forehead was hot to my hand. The red light girl, between whose legs I was wedged, squeezed herself into an even tighter crouch so that Betsie could lie almost flat across my lap. I dozed too, from time to time my head on the shoulder of the friendly girl behind us. Once I dreamed it was storming. I could hear the hailstones on Tante Jan's front windows. I opened my eyes. It really was hailing. I could hear it rattling against the side of the car. Everyone was awake now and talking. Another storm of hail, and then we heard a burst of machine gun fire from the roof of the train. "It's bullets!" someone shouted. "They're attacking the train!" Again we heard that sound like tiny stones striking the wall, and again the machine guns answered. Had the brigade reached us at last? The firing died away. For an hour the train sat motionless, then slowly we crawled forward. At dawn, someone called out that we were passing through the border town of Emmerich. We had arrived in Germany.